But first of all, thank you very much for having me to talk in your seminar series. It's a real pleasure to do so, and thank you for indulging my topic, which is actually about modelling social networks, which is possibly a little bit different from some of the modelling that members of DARE are accustomed to. But I thought it might be of interest, given that its origins actually are very much in the spatial models that were developed in plant ecology in the mid-1970s. And so what I want to do is start by just saying a little bit about those models, how they then apply to the case of networks, and present what's really amounting to a hierarchy of possible assumptions that might drive the complexity of models, which we can then use empirically to actually assess which are of value and which are not. And then I'll present a couple of applications, one using some anthropological data from the mid-1970s, and then a more recent application which actually uses sampled network data, for which the conditional dependence models that I'll talk about are quite suitable. Needless to say, this is joint work with a number of others, which we've done over a number of years. So let me start with the spatial models, and this important paper by Julian Besag in the mid-1970s. Imagine we've got a spatial layout of sites. These might be potential, trees in a forest, plants in a field. And at each site, there's a random variable that indicates the sort of status of something of interest at the site. For example, is the plant at the site healthy or not? We're considering this very simple binary case, but the ideas can obviously be generalized to more complex cases quite readily, in fact. And we're thinking about this system of random variables as a finite system. There's only a finite number of sites, although it might be a very large number. And at each site, there's a potential realisation, little y of I at site I. And we're interested in building a probability model for the joint probability of the values of those random variables, but doing so with some assumptions about where there might be local conditional dependencies amongst the variables. And in order to capture those conditional dependencies, we conceive of a dependence graph whose nodes are the random variables themselves, so at all of the sites. And there are edges in this dependence graph if the two variables corresponding to the nodes for which the edge is to be formed are assumed to be conditionally dependent. And I'll say a little bit more about the nature of those assumptions in a moment. There's a really important theorem that had actually been around and known, but Besag actually developed a simpler proof of it. And it sets out the most general form of the joint probability given the assumption of the dependence graph. And that's actually a very helpful result because it allows us to write down the most general form of that joint probability model given those assumptions. And the form is shown here. We need to assume that at each site, it's possible if the possible values of the variable are 0 and 1, there's a non-zero probability of a 0 being observed at each site. And there's also a non-zero probability of the variables having the value of 0 at every site. This is the so-called positivity assumption. Hammersley-Clifford delayed publication of their theorem because they were trying to prove it without making this assumption, but it has since been determined that actually it probably is a necessary assumption. In any case, the most general form of the model is as given there, that the log of the ratio of the probability of a particular realisation over the probability of all those zeros can be expanded in terms of sort of main effects of the variables and their interactions or possible interactions, and these so-called G functions. And the important thing about the theorem is that those G functions for a collection of random variables are non-null if and only if the set of random variables to which they refer is a clique in the dependence graph. That is, every pair in the set is assumed to be conditionally dependent. So it becomes a fully connected subgraph of D. And so, for example, in that spatial layout that we started with, it's often assumed that two variables are conditionally dependent only if they're neighbours, either vertically or horizontally in the spatial layout. And that then simplifies the model very considerably because the only cliques in the dependence graph are then neighbouring pairs of variables. Now, how might this be useful for networks? Well, there's two very obvious ways in which we might think about generalising this to networks. The first is perhaps the more obvious, but it's not the one I'm going to pursue in this talk. I'm going to actually talk mainly about the second one, but it's worth just dwelling on this for a moment because it's a very natural extension, I think. And here we might conceive of there being a random variable associated with each node in a network. We generally call them actors if we're talking about social networks. They're people, but they can, of course, be other things, organisations or other kinds of actors. And we might assume that there's some fixed network in which those individuals are connected. And we might then hypothesize that two random variables for a pair of nodes are conditionally dependent only if they're close in the network. For example, if they're neighbours in the network as opposed to in a spatial layout. And that model has been developed and used in a number of different contexts and is very useful. But the case I'll mainly focus on is the case where we think about the nodes as given or fixed, and we're actually going to associate a random variable with each possible edge in the network. So if we've got two actors, I and J, or two nodes, I and J, there's a possible connection between them that's defined by a random variable Yij, and we're going to assume that two tie variables are conditionally dependent only if they are, in some sense, close in the network. And I'm going to say a bit more about what I mean by close. But one example, in fact, the first one that was really kind of considered in the literature by Frank and Strauss in that paper mentioned there, is the case where the tie from I to J and the tie from K to L, or the edge, those edges are conditionally dependent only if they share a node. So one of I or J is the same as one of K or L. And this gives rise to a class of models known as exponential random graph models. As I mentioned, the tie variables are just those possible edges between two nodes I and J, and we're going to assume they've got the value of 1 or 0. And there's a realization of each system of random variables, little y, and we're going to write down a model for the joint probability of those random variables. And by virtue of the Hammersley-Clifford theorem, it follows that that's exponential in form, and it has network statistics which are defined by the cliques in the dependence graph, at least in principle. We can actually simplify this further, and as I will do in a moment, but in its most general form, each clique in the dependence graph is a set of edge variables, and we can think of that as a configuration in the graph, because if all of those edges are actually present, it defines a subgraph of a particular type. And that the network statistic is really referring to whether or not that subgraph is present or not. There are parameters corresponding to each of those statistics, and the kappa is a normalizing quantity to ensure that the probabilities add up to 1. It's quite a problematic entity from a computational point of view, because of course for graphs on networks of any size, it needs to sum over all possible realizations of the graph, and there are way too many of them to actually compute So one needs to use various mechanisms to get around that, mainly Monte Carlo, Markov chain kinds of things. But we also make a couple of further simplifying assumptions in most cases, just to ensure that these graphs are, these models are relatively simply described. The first is a homogeneity assumption, and that here we assume that if two subgraph configurations, which correspond to cliques in the dependence graph, if they're isomorphic, then they have the same parameter. And that then allows us to have a single parameter for each isomorphism class of those configurations in the network. And the statistic corresponding to that parameter is a count of the number of such configurations in a particular realisation. So, for example, two very simple examples. The simplest possible is the Bernoulli or Erdős-Rényi kind of model class, in which we assume that all of the edge variables are conditionally independent. So the only cliques in the dependence graph are individual edge variables. That means there's only one isomorphism class that has a non-zero parameter, and it's the parameter, parameter for an edge, and the statistic that goes with that parameter is the number of observed edges in a particular graph. So it's a very simply described model which we can write down and draw samples from very readily. Unfortunately, I know of no single case where it's ever been shown to fit data that's been observed for social networks. So it's theoretically of great interest. And of course, much is now known about that particular model class, but it's not very useful as a model for networks that arise in human contexts. A more promising class, but actually also a class that turned out to be not so useful, but is theoretically even more interesting, is the Markov random graph case. And here we make that assumption that I mentioned a moment ago, that two edge variables are conditionally dependent if they share a node. So there's an overlap between ij and kl. And this gives rise to a class of configurations which have one of three or two forms, depending how you think about them. Certainly, the cliques in the independence graph correspond to configurations that are either single edges, what are called star subgraphs, so a node that's connected to a number of others, and here we show an M star where a node is connected to M others, or they could also be triangles in the graph, so nodes I, J, and K, where each of those pairs of edges share a node, and so that's a model parameter. We also often make a second simplifying assumption so that the number of parameters doesn't depend on n, and we propose a single statistic for a set of related configurations. So for the star parameters, for example, we propose a functional form for the statistics for those stars of various orders. This is equivalent to using a geometrically weighted function of the node degrees, so that what we actually measure is the propensity for star formation, but with progressive discounting of the effect of an additional edge. So if the parameter is positive, stars tend to form, but as a node has more and more other nodes connected to it, this effect is diminished in its magnitude. And this has proved to be a very useful an approach from an empirical point of view, and has led to significant benefit in formulating models that can fit a number of observed graphs with a relatively small number of parameters, as I'll show in a moment. To actually estimate the model, we need to use some sort of computational approach to a maximum likelihood estimation, and there are various proposals in the literature that are now implemented in widely used packages for versions of MC, MLE. And those of you who are familiar with those sort of tools will can read about the detail, but I think you probably have an understanding of the sorts of approaches that we need to specify. I didn't think it would be useful to go through that in detail. So let's then get to the idea of, what sorts of assumptions about conditional dependence might be useful in the network case. And first begin with a couple of observations from social scientists who've been thinking about networks in the case of Siegfried Nadel for a very long time. He was, I think, the first professor of anthropology in Australia, or sociology. In any case, he was a very important figure in Australian social sciences. But he realised, without necessarily developing an appropriate formalism for this, that when we think about networks, we do need to think about processes in which what happens between two actors in a network must affect what happens between another pair of actors in the network. And so he was searching for a way of reflecting that kind of mutual interdependence between formation of ties in a network in order to describe, how networks come to be the way in which they are. Harrison White, also a very important mathematical sociologist, had a similar kind of idea that you can think about ties as being both dependent on and giving rise to other ties in the network. So this sort of mutual interdependence of ties in the network is theoretically very appealing to social scientists. But I guess the question for us is, and one I want to explore very briefly now, is, but when should we assume that two tie variables are conditionally independent? So one way of thinking about this problem is to actually just think about the logical possibilities and then see where that leads. And so what I'll now do is sort of think about what those possibilities might be that might be related to useful social processes and see where we get to. So we're thinking in this scheme of two nodes I and J having a potential tie between them, and two nodes K and L having a potential tie between them, and under what circumstances would those potential ties be conditionally dependent? Well, one answer to that question might be when all of the other possible ties in that system of ties between four people might actually be present, because you would expect such an arrangement. For example, if you had a socially cohesive group, you would certainly expect the value of the tie from I to J to be very dependent on the value of the tie from K to L. And so that kind of process, which is much described in the social science literature, could be one form of interesting dependence. Slightly less intense, perhaps, is when there's already some tie between I and J on the one hand and K and L on the other, and vice versa, because that scenario, if both the tie from I to J and K to L are present, it creates a cycle in the graph, and that allows for social processes of social monitoring, influence, the development of trust, and a number of other things. So that's a potentially important case. Another possibility is where one of the ties has, one of the nodes in the IJ set has ties to both of the nodes in the KL set, but it might be in this asymmetric pattern where it's only one of the nodes that's linked to K and L. And that might be interesting because it allows us to think about processes in networks where boundaries are created, which might inhibit the connection of nodes within a boundary to nodes outside of the boundary, or it might allow for bridging processes in which a node within a sort of tight cluster comes to be connected to someone outside. There's multiple ways of thinking about it. And also it could be simply that you might develop a tie when there's already a tie between one node in one set and one node in the other, simply because that makes them a little bit closer in the network. It's quite a general condition, but that may be something we need to think about. So these four possibilities are really four sort of ways of thinking about closeness between two pairs of tie variables. And a different dimension to thinking about this might be the length of the paths, those red paths in these four different structures. So we can think of them as being direct connections, so path lengths of one, or we might allow for the path lengths to be even longer or even shorter. They could be 0, in which case we're getting overlap between nodes in the two sets, or longer, in which case they're going to be based on sort of more and more distant existing connections. And if we put these two ideas together, we actually generate a whole hierarchy of dependence assumptions, which we can set out like this. The simplest, and let me go to the next slide because we've got a little bit more information attached to it. The simplest is the model that sits at the top, the one that I described earlier, the Bernoulli or Erdős-Rényi model. And it can be generalized in two quite different ways. The SI one, so that uses that first model of strict inclusion, and it gives rise to a model in which all of the configurations are clique-like structures. The Markov model, though, generalized in a different way, giving rise to models in which the configurations are style arc structures or closures of those structures in the form of a triangle. But the next two models, which are circled in red here, happen to be generalizations which are proving much more useful. As I said at the beginning, we rarely see a network that is well described by a homogeneous Bernoulli model. We rarely see a network that is well described by a Markov model. And in fact, we have a great deal of difficulty fitting models that are based purely on cliques because they're very unlike the kinds of networks we observe in practice. But these next two models, the so-called social circuit model, the first one is based on an inclusion logic. So each of the nodes in one tie is connected to each of the nodes in the other tie, or one of the nodes in the other pair. Or that more asymmetric version that I mentioned, which gives rise to this, to configurations which are triangles with edges hanging off them, or edge triangles as we're calling them here. I understand in the computer science literature, these are often called Poor graphs, but we've stuck with the edge triangle configuration. Or we get graphs with paths, and we get longer, more and more general versions of these by allowing path length to increase. But the four sort of strands of models that are generated do seem to pick up the sort of main ideas that people talk about when they analyze the structure of networks: the degree of cohesion, the degree of closure, the degree of brokerage that's going on in the network. So that's the connection of denser structures to less dense structures, or just general connectivity in the network. So it does seem that this model class does a good job of sort of enabling us to study the sorts of processes that sociologists and social scientists have been interested in, and to do it in a sort of in a way that we understand the sort of underpinning graph theoretical logic of these conditional dependence assumptions. In practice, these models have now been widely used, but almost certainly, 90% of the applications or more use the social circuit version of the model. And it's only just this last year that we've finally worked out the combinatorics for the edge triangle models, because they do get a little bit tricky. So just to summarize these different models that I've been talking about and the effects that are included in the models, we're really talking only about 6 potential parameters in the model to get a reasonable kind of range of behavior in networks in a form that can be characterized in a model. The Bernoulli model just has the edge parameter. The Markov model has edges, alternating stars and triangles, etc. Social circuit model, which is based on that inclusion assumption, adds the potential for more complex layers of triangles and more complex layers of two paths in the network. And again, we use that approach of coming up with a single statistic for each family of configurations of that type. And then the final model adds a further statistic that is a function of all of the different values of the number of edges that's hanging off the triangle and the number of layers in the triangle to come up with a single statistic. So let me now talk about an application of these models to a particular network. This is data gathered by, again, an Australian anthropologist, Bruce Kapferer, who was studying a factory, the workers in the factory, and was basically interested in the relational structure amongst the factory workers and how that might relate to some of the things he observed, including the success or otherwise of initiatives to have a strike before enterprise agreements or whatever they were called in those days were settled. That'll be a familiar scenario for many. The network itself, just to describe it in a little bit more detail, it's reasonably dense. It's got a density of 0.3, so 30% of the ties that could be there are there. It's got quite heterogeneous degrees, so the number of nodes that any particular node is connected to ranges from 2 to 25, with a median of 11. And it's quite clustered in the sense that the global clustering coefficient is the proportion of two paths in the network that are actually closed by a triangle in the network. And that's, just under half. So it's quite large. Similarly for the local clustering coefficient, which is the average of that statistic in the local network around each node. And there's also a lot of cliques in the network. There are 7 cliques of size 7, 56 of size 6, etc. So there's quite a lot of deep connectivity in this network. And the reason it's of interest here is that the social circuit model that I referred to hasn't been so successful in modelling very dense or clustered networks. And so we'll see that that's indeed the case here. So we fit 3 models to the network: the Bernoulli model, the social circuit model, and the hybrid edge triangle model. I haven't fitted the social circuit model. It's probably unfittable, and likewise the Markov model probably also unfittable. I'll get back to what these parameters might mean, but I just want to make a few comments about how we think about goodness of fit for these models. Each model, of course, identifies a set of parameters, and every possible graph on, in this case, 39 nodes has some probability of occurring under the model. But what's of interest is whether or not the model class has a reasonable probability of reproducing features of an observed network. So what we often do to think about goodness of fit is to take a fitted model, draw a random sample of graphs from that model, using something like a Metropolis algorithm to sample from the random graph distribution, and then for each statistic of interest, construct the distribution of values in those sampled graphs, and use a t-statistic to locate the value of that same statistic for the observed graph in the distribution of sampled graphs. And of course, if that statistic is very large in magnitude, it suggests that the observed value is unusual given the model. And if we see that for lots of statistics of interest, we probably think we haven't got a very good model. That's basically the logic of the approach that we're using. And this next slide just summarizes the fit of 3 models using various different configurations, various size stars, triangles, cliques, what are called bow tie graphs, 2 triangles sharing a single node, 3 paths, so paths of length 3, 4 cycles, characteristics of the degree distribution, and various measures of clustering in the network. And we can see that the Bernoulli model, which is model 1, clearly fails to, or looks very different from the observed graph in many, many cases. Model 2, which is the social circuit model, does a lot better. And in fact, it really does quite a lot better, but it just fails to capture the depth of clustering in the network, which is sort of more or less what I said we would probably see. And you'll see that it fails to reproduce the expected number of 4, 5, 6, and 7 cliques are way lower than the number that are in the observed graph. The rest of it's probably not so bad. But model 3 actually does a good job of capturing all of those statistics. There may be other statistics, of course, that we haven't measured and it's not doing very well, but this does at least give us some comfort that the model class is like the observed graph in some respects. And what do these models mean? The Bernoulli model, not so interesting. In the social circuit model, there's a positive alternating triangle statistic at the same time as a negative 2-path statistic, which suggests that by and large, 2 paths are being closed by triangles. And this is a phenomenon that's seen in many social networks. It's a feature of many social networks. The hybrid edge triangle model actually gives us a slightly more nuanced version of that, which is certainly that there is clustering in the network. We no longer have a positive alternating triangle parameter. In fact, the only positive parameter is the one for what we're calling here the alternating edge, alternating triangle parameter. So it's a single statistic based on that edge triangle structure or structure. And it's positive, and it's suggesting, yes, there's clustering in the network, but that clustering is concentrated around the higher degree nodes, and the higher degree nodes are concentrated around clustering. So those 2 things are interacting in a way that suggests that overall getting much more of a core periphery structure in this network. So that's actually quite a helpful insight. And in fact, the 2-path parameter is no longer negative. It's sort of very mildly positive, suggesting that actually you can have 2 paths surviving in the periphery of the network in a way in which they tend not to in the center of the network. And I'll briefly mention a second application, because this illustrates that these conditional dependence sort of approaches to thinking about networks do have some advantages when we think about very large networks, which we can't always observe in practice. And this network, or fragments of a network, in fact, comes from a study by colleagues at the Burnett Institute in Melbourne, who are interested in the spread of hepatitis C virus, and who actually collected the data using an approach to contact tracing to try and get an understanding of the way in which there was a social element to the spread of HCV. So what they did was they took a random sample of, well, it wasn't so random as it turned out. It was supposed to be a random sample of people who use drugs in 3 locations in Melbourne. And these are the yellow nodes in this diagram. And they then asked people whether they inject drugs with other people, in company with other people. And some said yes, and they nominated those people, and they were then approached and invited to participate in the study as well. And those are the blue nodes in the diagram. And then they were also approached to nominate any other people with whom they engaged in injecting of drugs, and those are the pink nodes in the diagram. At that stage, the research funding ran out, and so these are the data. So the question of interest here is whether we can use these data to actually build a probability model for the entire network of people of contact of this kind amongst people who inject drugs in Melbourne. And the logic, or the sort of key idea here, is that if we have this kind of contact tracing sampling process, or it's often called snowball sampling in the network literature, in which we begin with, in this case, the yellow nodes. We identify the partners of the yellow nodes, who are the green nodes. We then identify the partners of the green nodes, who are the red nodes, if they're not other green nodes or yellow nodes, and then go, one further layer. The key insight here is that if we think about the tie variables amongst the yellow and the green nodes, those tie variables may well be conditionally dependent on connections to the red nodes, but they're going to be conditionally independent of connections between the red and the blue nodes. So that actually allows us to, if we make the social circuit assumption, as we have in this case, because it's not a very clustered network, that allows us to actually come up with a strategy for estimating the model across the entire network just by working on the data by modelling the ties amongst the yellow and the green nodes, given the connections to the red nodes. In fact, we don't actually need the blue nodes in this case at all. And if we do that and we estimate a model, here's a fitted model, we find rather similar to the case of the factory, a very strong clustering effect. So the alternating triangle parameter there is quite large, 1.71. There's a parameter included in this model for nodes being isolates, because there were a lot of isolates. So there's probably some mechanism we need to understand by which people choose to engage in injecting in company or not. And there's also a negative alternating two paths. So again, there's a tendency in this network for those two paths to be closed and form triangles. And there's also some effects for more individual or dyadic characteristics. So if people had the same level of daily use, they were more likely to be partners. If they were both young, they were more likely to inject together. And if they came from the same of the three locations of the study, they were also more likely to inject together. And that then allows us to sort of estimate, that allows us then to model across the entire network. We did have to figure out how big the network was, and that's another little machination which I won't go into, but suffice to say there was sufficient data in the fragments that we saw to come up with a pretty good estimate for the size of the network, because the values of the parameters depend on the network size, and there was actually a very narrow window which was possible given the values of the statistics. And that we can then use this model to actually come up with a model of transmission of HCV at the population level, which is potentially very useful. Of course, I've just talked about the network model. We also needed a sort of agent-based model for how transmission occurs at the interpersonal level, and that had to be calibrated with all of the sort of known data about infection from one person to another. Again, I won't go into that, but together these two things give us the possibility of simulating transmission across the entire population. And of course, we can then use that for a number of very useful things, not just predicting the outcome of an outbreak, but also to understand the impact of various treatment strategies. This story actually ended up, had a very happy ending in the end. because the government had been expected, a treatment for hepatitis C virus became available a few years ago, and it's very expensive individually, and it was expected that it would be rationed in some manner and not available to everyone all at once. And in fact, the team at the Burnett had secured funding to do a randomised control trial to test the effect of what turned out from the simulations by sampling networks, applying the agent-based model, and then considering various treatment scenarios. We'd worked out that a network-based strategy was going to give better population-level outcomes than just treating the same number of cases at random. In fact, the government chose to fund the treatment for all people identified as having HCV. So the randomised trial couldn't be done, but it was for a very good reason, because it meant that everybody got treated. But interestingly, it was found by using this model that the network-based strategy was potentially the more helpful one. So, and that there may be other disease situations where that will be useful. Now, I've talked a lot about networks and network models, but I haven't much talked about DARE, except to sort of ground them in spatial models from plant ecology right at the beginning. This model class has been extended to a lot of different sort of data structures with sort of slightly more complex characteristics. For example, the variables could be multi-valued. There might be multiple types of networks involved. They might connect to different types of nodes. Those nodes may have maybe at different levels. For example, people often talk about co-evolving models where the virus is evolving and the virus is being transmitted between people, and both of those processes are going on, and you can model that process at multiple levels. And also data might be temporal. All of those things are being pursued in this literature and are potentially useful. And of course, the dependence hierarchy that I talked about is based on a general graph theoretical proximity logic, and therefore potentially applicable to networks that are not social in character. For example, there has been some work in biological networks that looks quite promising. And already multimode networks are being used to study social ecological systems in which you have human actors doing some pretty bad things or pretty useful things to try and change a system, or, that might be of interest in the environments area. And that's another sort of potential source. And Michelle Barnes at James Cook University is one person who's been doing a lot of that kind of work recently. But let me stop there and see whether you have any questions.